Hello everyone, and welcome back to Crime Whisper. I know a lot of you like to listen to these stories as you fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you left a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from. And of course, if you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. It really helps the channel. Alright, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's mystery story. The case we're exploring tonight begins in a place you'd never expect. It all started during what seemed like a routine renovation of an old, decaying public restroom, one tucked away inside the residential compound of the County Livestock Bureau in Wan County, Guizhou Province, China. It was September 2014, and a local farmer named Lao Yan, working as a temporary laborer, was assigned to help with the reconstruction. The restroom had been standing for over 35 years, its foul odor long ignored until it was finally scheduled to be rebuilt under new sanitation standards. On the evening of September 10th, as his shift was ending, Lao Yan pulled an old woven sack from the bottom of the septic pit. Inside, he found a pile of bones, assuming they were animal remains. Not an uncommon sight near local slaughterhouses. He set the bag aside and went home, exhausted from a long day's work. But the next morning, September 11th, everything changed. As Lao Yan returned to the site and continued clearing debris, old bricks, tiles, and dirt, he made a chilling discovery: a human skull, intact and unmistakable. In an instant, his mind flashed back to that bag of bones he'd found the night before. A shiver ran down his spine. He realized he had uncovered something horrifying, a secret that had been buried for years. Police from Wan County were called immediately. The restroom stood in a secluded courtyard, hidden from the main street by high walls and old buildings. Investigators arrived quickly, documenting every inch of the scene. Lying beside the septic tank was the skull, the old woven sack, and the bones Lao Yan had already unearthed. Forensic teams began their work, collecting fragments, searching for clues, and carefully retrieving what remained of the body. Among the items found were a faded shirt, a pair of FC jeans trousers, Western-style shorts, a cloth bag, and an old Samsung cell phone. But what was most striking wasn't what they found, it was what they didn't. There were no weapons, no knives, no blunt tools, just bones, clothes, and a phone. It didn't take long for police to reach their first conclusion. This was no accident. The body had been dismembered, placed in a sack, and dumped intentionally. There was no way this had happened by chance. But who was the victim? How long had she been buried there? And who could have done this? To find out, forensic experts attempted to reconstruct the skeleton using the skull and bones from the sack, but as the figure took shape, investigators were left speechless. The body appeared oddly built, no taller than 4 feet 7 inches, but with extremely broad shoulders and a muscular frame. The strange proportions puzzled everyone. Who could this person be? Further examination revealed something even darker. The skull bore deep slash marks across the nose and temple, clear evidence of foul play. The victim was determined to be female, aged between 26 and 29, standing around 5 feet 3 inches to 5 feet 5 inches tall. But there was still one more twist. When the bones were sent to the Ministry of Public Security's Forensic Center in Beijing for further testing, experts made a shocking discovery. The bones in the woven sack weren't all human. They belonged partly to cattle, meaning the local forensic team had unknowingly assembled a skeleton that was half human, half animal. This revelation explained why the remains appeared so strange. The septic pit, located beside the Livestock Bureau, had likely become a dumping ground for both human and animal waste over the years. With that cleared up, investigators had a clearer picture. The human skull and several genuine human bones belonged to a young woman, likely murdered and hidden there sometime after 2001, when the restroom had last been cleaned. Police began combing through records from the early 2000s, a painstaking task in a region with nearly 500,000 residents and over 100,000 migrant workers passing through over the years. Among more than 40 missing women reported since 2000, none immediately matched the evidence. A nameless victim, a hidden murder, and a mystery buried beneath the ground for over a decade. And this was only the beginning of the story. As investigators dug deeper, both literally and figuratively, one thing became painfully clear. The victim's identity was the key to everything. Without a name, there could be no suspect, no motive, and no justice. The forensic team began by focusing on the few solid leads they had: the victim's teeth and the Samsung phone found near the bones. The teeth were in good condition, allowing technicians to extract a clean DNA sample, which was then uploaded to China's national database. But weeks passed, and nothing came back. No match. Whoever she was, she didn't seem to have any record in the system. Meanwhile, detectives turned their attention to the cell phone, a model popular in the early 2000s, though the SIM card was long corroded. They hoped to recover some internal data. After several days of analysis, technicians managed to restore part of the device's memory. Hidden in its old logs was a single phone number, once frequently dialed before the phone went dead. The number belonged to a man named Joe Ming, a former accountant who had once worked for the same livestock bureau that managed the compound where the remains were found. When questioned, Joe appeared visibly nervous. He admitted that years ago, he had known a woman who'd suddenly disappeared, someone he described as a butcher's assistant, who often came to the compound to deliver meat. Her name, he said, was Yin Mei. That was the first time her name had surfaced in over a decade. According to Joe, Yin Mei was in her late 20s, hardworking but quiet. She lived in a rented room not far from the bureau, and was known to frequently visit one of the buildings inside the compound. When police checked old records, they discovered that a man named Li Gowei, a former maintenance worker, had lived in Building No. 5, the very structure bordering the restroom where the body was found. Li had resigned from his post in 2002 and moved away shortly afterward. His current whereabouts were unknown. The timeline was starting to take shape. The restroom had last been cleaned in 2001, and the body must have been dumped sometime after that. Right around the time Li Gowei disappeared, detectives decided to visit Li's old apartment, though it had long been abandoned. Investigators noticed something strange on the floor beneath the old tiles. Dark stains, faint but still visible after all these years. Samples were collected and sent for analysis, and within days, the results came back. The stains tested positive for human blood. The DNA from those traces matched perfectly with the DNA extracted from the skull. The woman found in the septic pit was indeed Yin Mei. Now, the case was no longer a mystery of who. It was a hunt for where Li Gowei had gone, and whether he was still alive. Police tracked down old employment records, tracing Li's trail through neighboring provinces. They found that after leaving one county, he had worked briefly in Enshan, then in Kunming, before vanishing again in 2005. But a single ID record from 2012 showed a man with his name had applied for a construction permit in Guangxi province. When officers finally located him, living under an alias in a remote village, Li Gowei was 56 years old, frail, quiet, and visibly stunned when investigators appeared at his door. At first he denied everything, but confronted with the DNA evidence and the timeline, his composure began to crack. And then, in a trembling voice, he confessed. Li said that he and Yin Mei had been lovers once, but over time, jealousy and resentment poisoned their relationship. In early 2002, after a heated argument, Li struck her once, then again, until she collapsed. In a panic, he tried to hide what he'd done. Working at the compound gave him access to the maintenance shed and septic area. That night, he dismembered her body and buried the parts inside the pit, hoping the stench of the restroom would mask the horror forever. For over a decade, it did. Until Lao Yan unknowingly uncovered the truth while doing his job in 2014. In 2015, Li Gowei was formally charged with intentional homicide. During his trial, he offered no defense, only a quiet apology and the words, "I thought time would erase it," but it never did. The court sentenced him to death with a 2-year reprieve, a punishment often commuted to life imprisonment. For many, the case was a reminder that no matter how deep a crime is buried, even beneath years of decay and concrete, truth has a way of resurfacing. Left with no clear answers, investigators knew they had to widen their search. They began visiting village after village, knocking on doors, speaking to residents, and compiling lists of every woman who had ever left for work and never returned, or who had mysteriously vanished from contact years before. A public notice was soon issued, offering a 10,000 yuan reward for any information that could help identify the victim. While one team focused on this painstaking search, another turned its attention back to the objects found at the scene: the faded shirt, the trousers, the old cloth bag, and the water-damaged cell phone. Could these items belong to the victim herself, or to her killer? Investigators started with the cloth bag. Printed across it were the words "My family." After tracing its origins, they discovered it had once been distributed as a promotional gift by a major telecommunications company to new customers who signed up for internet or phone services. That small clue, however, led nowhere. Just like the clothing, the trail faded into silence. That left one final piece of hope: the Samsung E838 cell phone. Released in late 2004, it had been popular in Wan County between 2005 and 2006, though the phone had been buried in the septic pit for years, soaked and corroded. Investigators managed to recover the device's original number and trace its chain of ownership. What they found surprised everyone. The phone had passed through 3 different owners: Li, Wang, and Zhang, 2 judicial employees, and 1 local businessman. By the time the case came to light, none of them were still living in Wan. Could one of these men have committed the murder before disappearing from town? Police discreetly investigated. Li and Wang were both found to be upright, law-abiding officials, and their transfers to other cities had all followed standard administrative procedures. As for Zhang, the businessman, he had no criminal record and no suspicious activity tied to his name. Once again, the trail went cold. None of the evidence, not the phone, the clothes, or the bag, brought them closer to either the killer or the victim's name. In the midst of this deadlock, Chief Investigator Jiang Wei and his mentor, Shi Min, returned repeatedly to the scene. The more they studied it, the more they realized something critical. The restroom was extremely isolated, accessible only through narrow passageways between housing blocks. Whoever had chosen this spot knew the area well. It was almost impossible that an outsider could have wandered in, carried a body, and vanished unnoticed. That meant the killer was most likely a local, someone who had lived or worked inside the compound. Following this logic, the team began focusing on residents who lived around the Livestock Bureau housing complex. Soon, 2 men drew their attention. The first was Liang, a man in his 40s, divorced, and notorious for his drug addiction. He lived directly opposite the restroom and was known to bring home different women over the years. Women who often came and went without a trace. Could one of them have met a violent end? Liang quickly became a prime suspect. The second man lived in building No. 5, the structure that bordered the restroom. Records showed he had once served 2 years in prison for illegal gambling back in 2005. Police collected DNA samples from both men as they searched for the truth buried beneath years of silence. By now, investigators had compiled files on 5 potential persons of interest: the 3 previous owners of the cell phone, and the two men who lived closest to the crime scene. Yet despite the mountain of data, no solid connection could be made between any of them and the victim. Then, just over a month after the skull's discovery, a breakthrough came. A special task force, reviewing missing persons reports, identified 3 women whose profiles matched the forensic findings almost perfectly. Their ages, heights, and estimated time of disappearance all aligned. Their names were Yuan, Zhang Yan, and An Fen. Yuan was a woman from northern China who had married into Wan County. She suffered from mental illness and had disappeared around 8 years earlier at the age of 30. Zhang Yan, just 18, had gone missing more than 15 years before, after leaving home to find work in another province. Her family never heard from her again. And finally, An Fen, 27 years old, healthy, and with no known history of illness, had also vanished without explanation over a decade ago. To determine the truth, police collected DNA samples from the relatives of all 3 women and compared them with DNA taken from the victim's teeth at the same time. The skull was sent to the prestigious Institute 213 in Tian, world famous for its craniofacial reconstruction techniques developed in the 1980s and used internationally. There, scientists photographed the skull from multiple angles and compared it to photos of each missing woman. If more than 27 anatomical points, such as the brow ridge, nasal bridge, and philtrum aligned, a positive identification could be made. When the results finally came in, they left no room for doubt. Both the forensic reconstruction and the DNA analysis from the Ministry of Public Security reached the same conclusion. The skull belonged to Luo Defan, the woman who had vanished more than 10 years earlier, known to those around her simply as Fen. The identification marked a turning point in the investigation. The veil of anonymity had finally been lifted. For the first time in years, the victim had a name, and with that name came a flood of new questions. Who was Fen? And who had wanted her dead? It turned out that Fen was no ordinary woman. In the small, tight-knit world of Wan County, she was widely known by her nickname, the Big Sister of the Tam Quarter. The name captured her fiery spirit perfectly. She was bold, outspoken, and utterly fearless. She defended the weak, spoke her mind, and refused to bow to anyone. People often said she carried herself more like a man than a woman, tougher, louder, and prouder than most men they knew. So who could have possibly had the strength or the courage to kill someone like her? Identifying her had brought a wave of relief, but it also opened up a tangled web of new mysteries. Fen's personal life, as investigators soon discovered, was far from simple. Before the age of 20, she had married and given birth to a son in Chuzhou, Jiangsu province. But when the boy was only 3, she walked away from her husband, her child, and that entire chapter of her life, returning to her hometown in Guizhou province, back in Wan. She earned a reputation for standing up for others, and for becoming romantically involved with several men. Among them was Lu Tingmin, a local man known for his temper. According to whispers around town, a third person, a woman named Xiao Di, had once intruded on their relationship, sparking tension and jealousy. For detectives, Fen's complicated love life became both a trail and a trap. Could they untangle this web of relationships to find out who had ended her life? The first person they considered was her estranged husband in Jiangsu. Could years of resentment and abandonment have driven him to track her down and exact revenge? But this theory fell apart quickly. The old restroom where her remains were found was in a secluded housing complex, a location only locals would know. It was nearly impossible for an outsider to find, let alone use, as a hiding place for a murder. The next suspect was Xiao Di, Lu Tingman's former girlfriend, the third person in that stormy triangle. Fen had once publicly humiliated her, even assaulting her in the street. Could Xiao Di have sought revenge? Again, the evidence said no. Xiao Di was not a local. She barely knew the area, and by all accounts, She was physically frail, hardly capable of overpowering someone as strong and fiery as Ah Fen. That left one man, Lu Tingmin, Ah Fen's boyfriend. Tingmin was a native of Wan County, 1 year older than Ah Fen. His father had been a bank official, and the family owned an apartment in the bank staff housing complex, just a short walk from the Livestock Bureau compound, where Ah Fen's remains were later found. From childhood, he knew every corner of that neighborhood, every shortcut, every hidden alley. When he and Ah Fen were together, they lived in his father's apartment. But according to neighbors, life inside that small home was turbulent. Fights broke out constantly. Their arguments echoed through the walls, sometimes deep into the night. Then, in late 2002, everything changed. Tingmin suddenly returned a box of Ah Fen's belongings to her mother, claiming the two of them had left town to work and save money for their wedding. But Ah Fen was not with him. Her mother didn't think much of it at first. Her daughter was known to leave home after arguments and reappear days later, but this time she never came back. From that moment on, Ah Fen was gone, and Lu Tingmin became the last person known to have seen her alive. For investigators, the conclusion was clear. He was their prime suspect. When police tried to locate him, they discovered that his father had long since passed away. His mother now lived alone, caring for 2 young granddaughters, while Tingmin himself was reportedly working as a cook on a cargo ship off the coast of Jia province. A special team of detectives was dispatched immediately to find him. But there was a problem. They had no hard evidence. Without it, even if they arrested him, he could deny everything and walk free. So the investigators took a calculated risk. They decided to search his old apartment in secret, the one he had shared with Ah Fen. They waited until his nieces left for school, then quietly slipped inside. Their goal was simple: find any trace of blood, any sign that the apartment had once been the scene of a violent crime, and their patience paid off. Under forensic light, faint reddish stains appeared on the tiled bedroom floor, stains that had been scrubbed, wiped, and hidden beneath years of dust. Blood, though faded and nearly invisible, it was enough. The breakthrough they had waited for. A warrant was issued immediately, and in Jiangsu, police closed in. When they arrested Lu Tingmin, the role of Ah Fen's killer was all but sealed. At first Tingmin said nothing. He claimed to remember nothing, to know nothing about any murder. He even pleaded with officers for protection, insisting he was innocent. But as investigators presented the mountain of evidence, the witness statements, the forensic results, and the traces of blood found inside his home, his silence began to crumble. And when he finally spoke, his story shifted. He admitted that Ah Fen had died in his apartment, but he wasn't the killer. Instead, he blamed his own father, saying the older man had disapproved of their relationship. According to him, when Ah Fen refused to leave, his father became enraged and killed her in a fit of anger. It sounded plausible after all. The father was dead and could no longer defend himself. But the investigators weren't convinced. They knew something didn't add up, and soon they would expose the lie that Lu Tingmin had built his entire defense upon, known to everyone simply as Oaf. For investigators, this was a breakthrough. The nameless victim finally had an identity. The long, grueling search had reached a turning point. But as the relief washed over the team, a new and even more complex challenge emerged. Who had wanted Ah Fen dead, and why? Ah Fen was not just another woman in Wan County. Locals called her the Big Sister of the Tang Quarter, a nickname that perfectly captured her reputation. She was fearless, outspoken, fiercely independent, and never afraid to stand up for herself or others. She had a strong sense of justice and a temper that few dared to provoke. In the small, tightly knit community of Wan, she was respected, sometimes feared, and often admired. But such a fiery spirit also meant she had made enemies. Her past was tangled. Before turning 20, She had married a man in Chuzhou, Jiangsu province, and given birth to a son. But when the boy was 3, Afen abruptly left her husband and child, returning to her hometown in Guizhou. There, she began to rebuild her life, known for defending the weak and getting involved in complicated relationships. Among her lovers was Lu Tingming, a man whose name would soon dominate the case file. There were also whispers about a third person, a woman named Xiao Di, who had once come between them. Investigators began piecing together her relationships, trying to find who among them might have wanted her dead. The first obvious suspect was her estranged husband back in Chuzhou. Had he nursed resentment all these years? Could he have tracked her down to take revenge for abandoning their child? That theory collapsed quickly. The place where her body had been hidden, a decaying public restroom, inside a closed-off residential complex, was known only to locals. An outsider could never have found it. Next, detectives turned their attention to Xiao Di, the woman Ofen had humiliated years earlier by attacking her in the street. Did she retaliate? Again, the evidence said no. Xiao Di was frail, not local, and incapable of carrying out such a violent crime. All threads led back to one man, Lu Tingmin, Ofen's on-and-off boyfriend. Tingmin was born and raised in Wan. His father had been a bank official, and his family owned an apartment in the bank's staff housing complex, just a short walk from the old public restroom, where Ofen's remains were found. From childhood, he knew every alley and back street of the city, including the isolated livestock bureau compound that would later become the burial site when he and Ofen lived together. Their neighbors often heard shouting, crashes, and violent arguments late into the night. The couple's fights were notorious. The tension escalated until late 2002, when Tingming returned Afen's belongings to her mother, saying they were leaving town to work and save for their wedding. But Afen never reappeared. Her mother, used to her daughter's impulsive behavior, didn't think much of it at first, until the years passed with no word. That was when police realized Lu Tingming was the last person to see Afen alive. When they looked for him, they found he had long left Wan. His father was dead, his mother lived with 2 grandchildren, and Tingming himself was working as a ship's cook in Ji. A special team was immediately sent to bring him in, but to arrest him, they needed proof. Without physical evidence, his denial could sink the entire case. So investigators took a calculated risk. They secretly searched his old apartment, waiting until his nieces left for school. They quietly entered and began scanning the floor with forensic lights. Then, faint but unmistakable bloodstains appeared on the tiles. Though time had faded them, the traces remained, enough to reopen the past. With that discovery, a warrant was issued. Police traveled to Jiangsu and arrested Lu Tingming. At first, he stayed silent, insisting he knew nothing about Ofen's death. He begged for protection, swore his innocence, and feigned confusion. But as detectives laid out the evidence, the blood in his home, the witness testimonies, and the timeline that cornered him, his defenses cracked. Finally, he confessed. His first version of the story blamed his late father. He claimed that his father had disapproved of Ofen, that an argument between them had turned violent, and that his father had accidentally killed her. But the story collapsed immediately. The man he accused had been elderly and frail at the time, incapable of killing a strong woman like Ofen. Cornered, Tingming broke down and told the truth. He admitted that he had killed Ofen, and even led police to where he had hidden her remains. Just 15 meters from the old public restroom stood an abandoned cement pit, once used for pig feed. Years of garbage had concealed the horrific secret beneath. He described how, at first, he was enchanted by Yufan's confidence and looks, but over time, their relationship became toxic. He discovered she had a child from her previous marriage, and their fights became frequent and brutal. He once changed the locks and started dating Xiao Di, only for Ofen to attack her publicly. Ofen's obsession grew. She broke back into his home, slashed his clothes, and refused to let him go. Then came the fatal night. After hearing rumors from his father that Ofen had been seen with another man, jealousy consumed him. When he returned home that night, the confrontation turned violent. Ofen grabbed a fruit knife and cut his arm. In a burst of rage, Tinman snatched a kitchen knife and struck her down. Panicked, he wrapped her body in a bedsheet, one her family would later recognize as missing, and carried her to the old cement pit. He buried her under trash, trusting the stench of decay to mask his crime. Months later, terrified of being discovered, he returned, unearthed the skull, and tossed it into the septic tank of the nearby restroom, hoping to erase the last trace of her existence. For years, he drifted from city to city, from Tibet to Chongqing to Shanghai, before finally settling in Jiangsu. He married, had children, and worked as a cook. But the memory of that night haunted him endlessly. "I never knew peace," he told police. "Even when I smiled, I was terrified inside." In June 2015, the People's Court of Suzhou City sentenced Liu Tingming to life imprisonment for intentional homicide and ordered him to pay 60,000 yuan in compensation to Ofen's family. He accepted the verdict without appeal. Behind bars, his new family fell apart. His wife and children bore the shame of his crime, while Ofen's parents, especially her elderly mother, continued to mourn the daughter they'd lost to violence and secrecy. The case of Wan County became more than a murder investigation. It became a chilling reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to the surface. Justice may come late, but when it does, it leaves no shadow. UNLIT. In the quiet countryside of Wanfeng Village, located in City, Fujian Province, China, there stood a striking four-story red brick house that towered over the surrounding farmland. Its bright walls made it impossible to miss, a symbol of the Qin family's success after years of hard work. Inside lived Mr. and Mrs. Qin with their 4 children. Among them, the 2 youngest daughters, Chen Beilin and Chen Beozhin, were the pride of the family. They were 3 years apart in age, gentle in nature, and admired for their beauty and intelligence. Beilin, the elder sister, was calm and mature. Beojian, the younger, lively and affectionate. Together, they brought warmth and laughter to their home. Mr. Qin, a farmer who had toiled for decades to provide for his family, dreamed of giving his daughters the education and future he himself never had. Through sheer determination, that dream became reality. Both sisters graduated from high school with excellent grades and earned the chance to study abroad in Japan. It was an enormous achievement for a rural family. The entire village spoke of the Qins with admiration. 2 daughters, studying overseas, chasing bright futures. Even though distance separated them, the family remained close. Mr. Qin called his daughters often, video chatting with them every week. They would share stories of their new life abroad, about part-time jobs, Japanese food, and the cherry blossoms that lined their campus. The sisters always smiled brightly through the camera, assuring their parents that everything was fine. Then came the evening in 2017 that shattered everything, as usual. Mr. Qin opened his laptop and called his daughters for their weekly video chat. The connection took longer than usual, but when the screen lit up, there they were, Beilin and Beojian, both smiling, their room tidy and softly lit. They talked for nearly an hour, laughing, sharing plans for the weekend, and telling him how they missed home. When the call ended, Mr. Qin felt a deep sense of pride and comfort. His girls were safe. They were doing well, but he could never have imagined that it would be the last time he would ever see them alive. The next morning, repeated calls went unanswered. Their classmates couldn't reach them either. Concern turned to panic when the landlord reported that their apartment door was locked from the inside, but no one responded. When police forced entry, they were met with a chilling scene. Inside, the apartment was in perfect order, except for one detail. Both sisters were found lifeless on the floor beside the bed. their faces pale and serene, as if they had simply fallen asleep. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, and no evidence of robbery. Their personal belongings, passports, and money were untouched, at first glance. It looked like a tragic case of carbon monoxide poisoning, a common hazard during Japan's cold winter months when small gas heaters are used in closed rooms. But something about the scene unsettled the investigators. The sisters' phones had been turned off deliberately, and traces of sleeping pills were later found in their system. As the autopsy reports came in, the truth grew darker. The cause of death was not accidental gas poisoning, but a carefully planned poisoning involving sedatives and carbon monoxide. Someone had made sure the sisters would never wake up. Who could have done such a thing, and why? Detectives began retracing the sisters' final days. Their neighbors described them as polite, quiet, and friendly, rarely hosting visitors. But one name appeared again and again, a Chinese man named Wang Yao, who lived in the same building. He was described as charming, but secretive, often seen helping the sisters carry groceries or offering to fix things around their apartment. It seemed he had developed a close friendship with them, perhaps too close, as police dug deeper. They discovered that Wang Yao had once been a fellow student, but had dropped out months earlier. Since then, he had been living off odd jobs, and, as it turned out, borrowing money from the sisters. Witnesses recalled arguments between them, particularly when bail-in demanded repayment. The timeline grew chillingly precise. The night before the sisters died, Wang Yao was seen entering their apartment carrying a bag. Surveillance footage later showed him leaving just past midnight. Unhurried and carrying nothing. When authorities searched his residence, they found empty blister packs of sleeping pills, a small portable gas heater, and, most damning of all, fingerprints matching those found in the sisters' room. Confronted with the evidence, Wang Yao confessed. He admitted he had gone to their apartment that night under the pretense of returning borrowed money. Instead, he drugged their tea with crushed sedatives. Once they fell unconscious, he sealed the windows and doors, turned on the gas heater, and waited until the room filled with carbon monoxide. His motive: desperation and greed. He had gambled away the money he owed them, fearing they would expose his lies. Rather than face shame or debt, he chose murder, ending 2 innocent lives to silence them forever. When the news reached China, Wanfeng village was devastated. The bright red house that had once symbolized hope became a monument of grief. Mr. and Mrs. Chin were inconsolable. Every morning, the mother would sit by the window, staring at the road, whispering her daughters' names, as if waiting for them to return. In 2018, a Japanese court sentenced Wang Yao to death for double homicide. The Chin family traveled to Japan for the verdict, holding framed photos of their daughters, smiling in their university uniforms as they listened to the judge deliver justice. But justice, as it often does, brought little comfort. 2 young lives, full of promise and love, were extinguished by betrayal and greed, and for their parents, no verdict could ever fill the silence left behind. The red house in Wanfeng still stands today, quiet, immaculate, and empty, a haunting reminder of dreams that ended far from home. Reassurance. Before hanging up, he promised to send his daughters some of their favorite treats from back home. None of them could have imagined that this would be their final conversation. Just 1 night later, both daughters vanished without a trace. From that moment, an unshakable dread settled over the family, a feeling that something terrible had happened. Their fears were tragically confirmed a week later, when devastating news arrived from Japan, plunging the entire family into unimaginable grief. It was the night of July 13, 2017. Around 11:40 p.m., thick darkness covered a lonely road in Hidano City, Kanagawa Prefecture. A police car rolled quietly through the forested hills, its headlights slicing through the heavy night fog. Only the distant hum of insects disturbed the stillness. It had been 7 days since the Fujin sisters had disappeared. The patrol car came to a stop at a remote point along the road. Officers stepped out, flashlights in hand, sweeping the dense undergrowth. Their faint beams flickered across tree trunks and uneven ground, cutting through the suffocating black. Then suddenly, a voice called out. One officer had found something. The others rushed to his side. Just 16 feet from the roadside, partially hidden in the tall brush, lay 2 large suitcases, and from them rose a foul, unmistakable stench. Proceeding cautiously, the officers unzipped the cases. Inside were the bodies of Bolin and Bosun, the 2 sisters who had been missing for a week. The forensic report confirmed their identities: 25-year-old Bolin and 22-year-old Bosun, both from City, Fujin Province. They had come to Japan to study after finishing high school, living together in a small apartment in Naka Ward, Yokohama City, roughly 23 miles from where their bodies were found. Bolin had studied fashion design at a vocational college. Her life in Japan had not been easy. She juggled multiple part-time jobs to afford tuition and living costs, sometimes pausing her studies altogether. Because of this, it took her 8 years to graduate. She had finally completed her program 6 months before the tragedy and was working at a local restaurant. Her younger sister, Bosun, was a game software development student at a nearby school. She had followed Bolin to Japan 3 years later, and the 2 had lived together ever since, sharing not only rent, but their entire daily lives' work, meals, and even social circles. The first person to realize something was wrong was Miss A. Bolin's closest friend. Their friendship went back years. They spoke almost daily without fail. When Bosun arrived in Japan, she too became part of this tight-knit friendship trio. On the afternoon, a week before the discovery, Miss A messaged Bolin as usual, but hours passed with no reply. This was deeply unusual. Bolin always responded quickly, and if she ever couldn't, she'd immediately apologize and explain why. Concerned, Miss A then tried messaging Bosun. Again, silence. Now panic began to rise. Miss A started contacting everyone who might have heard from them. When she reached Bolin's co-workers, she was told something alarming. Bosun had not shown up for her shift that day, and hadn't called in either. Something entirely out of character. She was known for her responsibility and punctuality. Convinced that something was terribly wrong, Miss A rushed to the sisters' apartment in Hinodecho, Naka Ward, Yokohama. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a modest building, located in a busy entertainment district surrounded by bars and nightlife. Lively but not the safest area after dark. At 11 p.m., Miss A arrived and began knocking on their door, ringing the bell over and over. She waited, listening for any sound inside, but there was only silence. After many minutes, realizing no one was coming to the door, she reluctantly turned away and left unease gnawing at her the whole way home. However, as Miss A made her way down to the ground floor, she happened to run into the landlord. Her voice trembled with worry as she explained the situation and begged him to unlock the apartment so she could make sure the sisters were safe. But the landlord, bound by strict regulations, refused. Entering a tenant's room without proper authorization, or without the presence of management and police, was strictly prohibited. Desperate, Miss A pleaded again, this time suggesting they at least check the building's security camera footage. The landlord hesitated. It was late, and reviewing footage wasn't part of his usual duties. Still, Miss A's urgency and genuine fear made him uneasy. Something clearly wasn't right. After a moment's thought, he told her to go home and rest. He would contact the building management and the police first thing in the morning. At 9:30 a.m. the next day, Miss A's phone rang. It was the landlord. She rushed to the apartment building, where both management staff and police officers were already gathered. Together, they unlocked the door and entered the sisters' apartment. To everyone's surprise, The room was spotless. Everything was neatly arranged. No signs of a fight. No overturned furniture. No evidence of forced entry. It was as if the sisters had simply gone out. But Missa couldn't shake her unease. She insisted they reviewed the security camera footage. When the first images appeared on the monitor, silence filled the room. The recordings revealed that on the afternoon of July 5th, the two sisters had returned to the building carrying several bags of various sizes. Later that evening, as usual, Bozan left for her night shift job, leaving Bolin alone in the apartment. Then, at 1 a.m., the footage showed a young man appearing in the stairwell. His face was hidden beneath a hat and mask, and he moved quietly from the 4th floor down to the 3rd. What stunned everyone was that the man used a key to unlock Bolin's apartment door. He entered effortlessly. What happened inside could not be seen, but minutes later, the man stepped out. A small piece of rope slipped from his clothes and fell to the floor. The footage showed him freeze, clearly panicking. He snatched it up quickly and hid it inside his jacket. His frantic body language said something was terribly wrong. Over the next 4 hours, he went in and out of the apartment multiple times, even leaving once to buy water from a nearby vending machine before returning. It was as though he were waiting for something or someone. At 5 a.m., Bozan returned home from her shift. The camera captured her walking through the entrance, completely unaware of the danger waiting upstairs. She unlocked the apartment door and stepped inside as usual. Moments later, the door opened slightly, then quickly shut again. Investigators later speculated that she had noticed something strange and tried to escape, but failed. That was the last time either sister was seen alive. In the hours that followed, the man's behavior grew more disturbing. He was seen leaving the apartment drenched in sweat, his eyes darting nervously as he checked the surroundings, only to hurry back inside moments later. Finally, at 10 a.m., he emerged one last time. This time, his face was uncovered, his eyes red and swollen, as if injured. He carried a large bag slung over his shoulder and walked away quickly, disappearing down the street at that point. Police officers asked everyone except their own personnel to leave the viewing room. Missa waited anxiously in the hallway, her heart pounding. After what felt like hours, the officers reappeared, their faces grave. They warned everyone not to touch or alter anything in the apartment, and immediately called the main police station to launch a full investigation. From fragments of what Miss A overheard, the footage revealed even more disturbing details. In the early morning hours of July 7th, the same young man returned once again, this time dressed in a white t-shirt. He calmly used the key to unlock the door, stayed inside for only a few minutes, then re-emerged, dragging 2 large suitcases. He made several more trips, each time carrying bags out of the apartment before finally leaving for good. The police quickly formed their initial theory. Bolin had been murdered the night the man first broke in. When Bozan returned home hours later, she too became a victim. The next morning, the killer returned to dispose of the sisters' bodies, packing them into the very suitcases later discovered deep in the Kanagawa woods. From then on, Iwasaki Ruji began visiting the restaurant almost every day. At first, he seemed like just another polite, soft-spoken customer, often chatting briefly with Bolin while she worked. But over time, his interest grew more intense. He started waiting for her after her shifts, offering to walk her home, and bringing small gift snacks, accessories, even perfume. Though his gestures appeared harmless at first, Bolin's colleagues began noticing the man's persistence, and how his attention toward her crossed normal boundaries. At the time, Bolin was too kind-hearted to reject him outright. She viewed him as an overly enthusiastic friend, perhaps a bit lonely, and didn't want to hurt his feelings. But as months went by, Iwasaki's behavior became obsessive. He began sending her constant messages, calling repeatedly, and showing up uninvited wherever she went. When Bolin finally tried to distance herself, Iwasaki's attitude changed drastically. His tone became controlling, even threatening. Colleagues recalled hearing Bolin confide that she was frightened. She had once found him waiting outside her apartment building late at night, claiming he just wanted to talk. Despite these red flags, she tried to handle the situation quietly, not wanting to involve the police or cause trouble in a foreign country. As the years passed, Bolin moved apartments several times, perhaps to shake him off. Yet, somehow, Iwasaki always found her again. Investigators later confirmed that he had secretly followed her on multiple occasions, even learning where her new residence was. The situation escalated when Bolin's younger sister, Bozan, arrived in Japan and began living with her. Witnesses said that after Bozan's arrival, Iwasaki grew visibly jealous and agitated. He once confronted Bolin about spending too much time with her sister instead of replying to his messages. Then, about a month before the murders, a major incident occurred. According to testimony from Bolin's manager, she had mentioned that Iwasaki had become increasingly aggressive, raising his voice at her during one of his visits to the restaurant. After that, Bolin finally decided to cut off all contact with him. She changed her phone number and even blocked him on social media. From that point on, Iwasaki vanished from the restaurant. But in reality, he hadn't given up. He was watching silently from the shadows, harboring resentment and humiliation. Police believe that, on July 5, 2017, Iwasaki somehow obtained a copy of Bolin's apartment key, possibly from when he had once visited her home in the past. That night, while the sisters were out, he entered the building and waited. When Bolin returned, an argument likely broke out. Overcome by anger and jealousy, Iwasaki killed her in the apartment. Hours later, when Bozan came home, she too became a victim, perhaps because she had witnessed the aftermath or confronted him. When investigators pieced this together, they realized that Miss A's late-night visit had nearly changed everything. The chilling timeline showed that when she stood outside knocking on the door, the sisters' bodies were already inside, and Iwasaki was likely still nearby, returning soon after to clean up the scene. Had she lingered even a few more minutes, she might have come face to face with the killer. On July 17, after reviewing dozens of surveillance cameras across Yokohama and tracing the vehicle used to transport the suitcases, police tracked Iwasaki Ryuji to an apartment in the Aoba ward. When officers knocked on his door, he appeared startled but did not resist arrest. Inside his apartment, investigators found Bolin's personal belongings: a hair clip, a scarf, and receipts from their favorite cafe. But the most damning evidence came from DNA traces found on the handle of one of the suitcases and inside his car trunk, a perfect match to both sisters. He'd still be able to see his daughter's smiles today. That single question tormented him day and night. Mr. Chen replayed every moment leading up to their departure, the excitement in their eyes, the hope in their voices, the farewell at the airport when he told them to study hard and take care of each other. He had believed that sending them abroad would open doors to a brighter future, far from the limited opportunities back home. Never could he have imagined that the decision made out of love would lead to such unbearable loss. Now, as he stood before their photographs surrounded by flowers and incense, he felt as though the world had collapsed. The grief was so heavy it robbed him of breath. What haunted him most was not only the tragedy itself, but the endless what-ifs. What if he had chosen a different path? What if he had kept them home? What if he had recognized the dangers sooner? But no amount of regret could turn back time. All that remained for Mr. Chen and his family was the determination to seek justice, to ensure that the man who had so cruelly taken their daughters' lives would face the full weight of the law. Even through his tears, Mr. Chen vowed that his daughters' deaths would not be in vain, and that their story would serve as a painful reminder to protect those who leave home in search of a better life. 3 days after his arrest, police brought Iwasaki Ryuji in for another round of questioning. What he said next stunned everyone. He insisted vehemently that he had never intended to harm the sisters. According to his story, Bolin and Bosun had planned the whole thing themselves. Desperate to avoid deportation when their student visas expired, they supposedly hatched a scheme to be listed as missing so their records would be frozen and they could quietly return later. Iwasaki painted himself as their willing accomplice, the man who simply ferried the 2 suitcases to a prearranged drop-off point and left. The explanation was bizarre and quickly fell apart under scrutiny. Even if the sisters had been reckless enough to try such a plan, the method made no sense. Suitcases cannot be opened from the inside. Sealed in a confined case in summer heat, anyone would face rapid suffocation. Forensics delivered the final blow to his story. Both women bore fatal injuries, evidence that they had been dead before being packed. The timeline from CCTV and travel records showed Iwasaki alone taking the suitcases away. No one else visited the scene after he left. Every piece of objective evidence pointed to him. As the investigation continued, more damning details emerged. Photographs and testimony sketched a long, complicated relationship between Bolin and Iwasaki, a closeness that had become possessive over time. A workplace photo showed Iwasaki standing beside Bolin with an odd intimacy that colleagues remembered as unsettling. Crucially, police analysts found troubling searches on Iwasaki's phone, queries about how to cover up crimes and evade detection. Those search records undermined his helping a friend defense and suggested advanced planning. A month after the murders, the sisters' funeral was held in Yokohama. Flowers and photos gathered in the apartment building where they had lived, and the international student community mourned. But while the town grieved, investigators quietly pieced together motive and method. Interviews with friends, family, and co-workers, along with a careful reconstruction of messages and movements, gradually revealed the darker reality behind Iwasaki's lies, a premeditated crime cloaked in a flimsy story of collusion. Behind Iwasaki's crime, investigators uncovered a complex web of emotions and motives. Interestingly, one small part of his earlier story, the visa issue, wasn't entirely fabricated. In reality, Bolin's student visa was close to expiring, and she was under pressure to find a way to remain in Japan legally. For many foreign students in similar situations, marrying a Japanese citizen was one of the fastest and most reliable solutions, based on testimonies and circumstantial evidence. Police speculated that Bolin might have discussed a possible marriage arrangement with Iwasaki to resolve her visa problem. Given the 14-year age difference between them, investigators doubted it was a relationship built on mutual affection or long-term commitment. It was more likely a practical decision from Bolin's side, one that deeply wounded Iwasaki's pride. After years of financial and emotional investment, he may have felt betrayed and used, and his resentment slowly turned into rage. The tension reportedly escalated the day before the murders. Bolin and her sister Bosun had gone on a short trip with a friend, keeping it secret from Iwasaki. When he found out, he became furious, an emotional breaking point that likely triggered his deadly intent. That night, after the sisters returned home, they spoke with their father on a video call. Bolin stayed in to rest while Bosun went to work her evening shift. Using a spare key and a rope, Iwasaki quietly entered the apartment. After a heated argument, he strangled Bolin to death. He then waited inside the apartment for hours until Bosun returned early the next morning and killed her as well, because it was already daylight. Iwasaki temporarily left the scene. The following morning, he returned to clean up, placed both bodies into suitcases, and transported them to a remote area on the outskirts of Hadano City. Surveillance cameras captured his car and movements, providing crucial evidence that led to his arrest. 3 days after the sisters' funeral, Iwasaki was transferred to the prosecutor's office, officially entering the judicial process. A year later, the first trial opened at the Yokohama District Court. Iwasaki Ryuji was charged with double murder, body concealment, and related crimes. Prosecutors argued that the murders were premeditated and brutal, showing no sign of remorse, and demanded the death penalty. The defense, however, repeated its claim of innocence, maintaining that Iwasaki's relationship with Bolin was genuine and that he had merely assisted in the sisters' supposed disappearance plan. After 2 weeks of hearings, the court delivered its verdict. Iwasaki was found guilty and sentenced to 23 years in prison. The ruling immediately sparked outrage. Many online users criticized the sentence as too lenient, arguing that it failed to reflect the gravity of the crime or the suffering of the victim's family. But the legal process didn't end there. 1 year later, the Tokyo High Court reviewed the case and made a critical decision to send it back to the Yokohama District Court for retrial. Under Japanese law, if a high court identifies serious procedural or judgmental errors in a lower court's ruling, such as misjudging evidence or applying improper sentencing standards, it cannot directly correct them. Instead, the case must return to the original court for reconsideration. The High Court found fault in how the first trial evaluated the severity of the act. The Yokohama court had reasoned that, because Iwasaki did not use a weapon like a knife, the crime fell into a less severe category. However, the High Court countered that the method of killing, manual strangulation and confinement, was equally lethal, especially considering the victims were 2 young women of smaller build. Thus, the High Court ruled that the lower court's sentence was unreasonably light, ordering a full retrial. The victim's family expressed relief at the decision, but also deep anger. 2 years had passed since the tragedy, yet they still felt justice had not been served. In China, they noted, a premeditated double murder like this would almost certainly result in capital punishment. The retrial of Iwasaki Ryuji began in the Yokohama District Court in early 2023, nearly 3 years after the murders. This time, the atmosphere inside the courtroom was heavier than ever. Both the Japanese and Chinese media closely followed the proceedings, as public opinion had grown increasingly fierce, demanding a harsher sentence. During the retrial, the prosecution reaffirmed that the murders were carefully premeditated, emphasizing the cruelty and composure with which Iwasaki had acted. They presented new forensic and digital evidence, including detailed search records from his phone and laptop, proving that, in the weeks leading up to the crime, he had searched phrases such as how to hide a body, how to clean bloodstains, and how to avoid detection by police. These searches destroyed any remaining doubt that the killings were accidental or impulsive. The prosecutors stated, "The defendant not only deprived 2 innocent young women of their lives, but also attempted to deceive society with a fabricated story. His actions show a cold, calculated disregard for human life." They once again demanded the death penalty, arguing that anything less would be an insult to justice and to the memory of the victims. The defense clung to its old narrative, insisting there was no proof of intent to kill and that the sisters' deaths were accidental results of a misguided plan. But the evidence this time was too overwhelming. The retrial brought forward new testimonies from acquaintances, including a coworker who revealed that Iwasaki had previously expressed anger and jealousy toward Bolin, saying that if she ever betrayed him, he wouldn't forgive her. The trial stretched on for weeks. When the final verdict was announced, the courtroom fell silent. The presiding judge declared that Iwasaki's actions were deliberate, cruel, and beyond forgiveness. The defendant exploited the victims' trust, took their lives with premeditated malice, and attempted to conceal his crimes. His actions caused immeasurable grief to the victim's family and deep fear throughout society. This time, the Yokohama District Court sentenced Iwasaki Ryuji to life imprisonment. The decision was a partial victory for the prosecution, though not the death sentence they had sought. The new verdict acknowledged the severity and planning behind the crime. Outside the courthouse, Mr. Chen, the victim's father, broke down in tears as he addressed the media. No sentence can bring back my daughters. But at least now, the truth has been recognized. I hope no other parent ever has to endure what we went through." Public reaction remained divided. Some believed life imprisonment was an appropriate balance between justice and Japan's cautious approach to capital punishment. Others argued that a man who had taken 2 young lives so mercilessly deserved nothing less than death. In both Japan and China, the case left a lasting mark, a painful reminder of how obsession and emotional dependence can twist into violence. Over time, the apartment where the Chen sisters once lived became a quiet memorial site. Each year on the anniversary of their deaths, flowers and letters would appear at the doorstep from classmates, neighbors, and strangers who had followed their story. For Mr. Chen, the grief never faded, but he continued to speak publicly about his daughters, hoping their tragedy would raise awareness about the vulnerabilities of international students living abroad and the need for stronger protection for them. The Yokohama double murder case, as it came to be known, remains one of Japan's most haunting crimes in recent years, not only for its brutality, but also for the chilling calmness of the man who committed it, and the enduring sorrow of a father who sent his daughters overseas, chasing dreams that ended in tragedy. But in Japan, the death penalty is applied with extreme caution, involving strict, lengthy judicial procedures. 2 years later, in July 2021, the retrial for the case began at the Yokohama District Court. Hayasaki continued to adamantly claim his innocence, refusing to answer any questions, an attitude that only deepened suspicions about his guilt. This time, the prosecution withdrew their initial demand for the death penalty and instead sought a life sentence. After 2 months of proceedings, the Yokohama District Court sentenced Iwaki Ruja to life imprisonment. The verdict stated that, after careful and thorough deliberation, the court concluded that a life sentence was the most appropriate punishment for the crimes committed by the defendant. Story 3. On the morning of May 8th, in the quiet town of Berkeley Springs, West Virginia, a 15-year-old girl named Riley Crossman vanished without a trace. What first appeared to be a routine missing person case soon turned into a horrifying murder investigation, one that would expose the terrifying truth behind Riley's final moments through her last desperate text messages. This is the heartbreaking story of a teenage girl who never had the chance to grow up, and the painful search for justice that followed. Riley was born on December 22, 2003, the eldest of 3 siblings. She had 2 younger brothers, Reed and Riker. In 2019, at just 15, Riley was in a relationship with her schoolmate Hayden, a year older than her. The two were inseparable, constantly on the phone, sometimes keeping a call going for 48 hours straight, even falling asleep while still connected. Riley's parents, Chantel and Lance, had divorced when she was young. The children lived primarily with their mother, while Lance supported them financially and visited on weekends. Despite the separation, Lance remained a devoted father, always making time to see his kids and keep their bond strong. For years, Chantel had worked tirelessly in the food service industry, and by 2017, her dedication paid off. She was promoted to manager at a local restaurant. Life seemed to be looking up, but that same year, fate took a turn when she met Andy McCauley, a 39-year-old HVAC installer who worked for the restaurant owner. After just 1 month of dating, Andy moved in with Chantel. From that moment, things began to change, not for the better. Tensions rose between Chantel and Dawn over work disagreements, and by November 2018, Chantel decided to resign from the restaurant she had poured her heart into. Not long after, Andy also quit his job at Dawn's company. Their simultaneous resignations enraged Dawn, who also happened to be their landlord. When Chantel and Andy fell behind on rent, Dawn filed a lawsuit to evict them from the house. Despite the chaos, one thing about Chantel never changed: her devotion to her children. Supporting a family of 5 on her own was exhausting, every day. She woke early to take her kids to school, then spent her mornings and afternoons at Mountain View Solar, where she worked from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Immediately after, she changed clothes and rushed to her second job at a local restaurant, working until 10 p.m. almost every night. By late March 2019, Chantel and Andy moved the family into a modest house at 15 Greenway Drive, an older place, but affordable and conveniently close to Riley's school. They hoped the change of scenery would mark a new beginning after months of struggle, but no one could have predicted what was about to happen. On May 7, 2019, a Tuesday like any other, Chantel followed her usual routine 2 jobs, back to back. By the time she returned home around 10 p.m., she was utterly exhausted. Dragging herself upstairs, she paused at Riley's door to say goodnight, but something caught her attention. The lights inside were still on, and the door remained closed. Police initiated a missing person investigation. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, showing Riley's picture, and asking if anyone had seen her that morning. They checked local businesses, bus stops, and security cameras in the area, but the results were discouraging. No one had seen the 15-year-old girl after the previous night. It was as if Riley had vanished into thin air. Meanwhile, detectives also interviewed her classmates and teachers. None of them had received messages from Riley that morning, and she hadn't shown up for first period or any class at all. Her boyfriend, Hayden, was contacted during his field trip to Washington, D.C. He told investigators that he'd last spoken to Riley late the previous night. They'd been on a video call until nearly midnight, and when he said goodbye, she seemed perfectly fine, lying in bed and smiling as usual. This statement deeply unsettled Chantel. If Riley was fine when she went to sleep, then something must have happened in the hours between midnight and dawn. As investigators began piecing together the timeline, they turned their attention to everyone living in the house, especially Andy McCauley, Chantel's live-in boyfriend. His strange disappearance that same morning raised immediate red flags. According to Chantel, Andy had left home before dawn, around 5 a.m., supposedly for work, but his employer confirmed he had clocked in for only a few hours before leaving abruptly, saying he had a family emergency. No one had seen or heard from him since. Police decided to visit the house again that night for a more thorough search. They examined Riley's bedroom. Nothing seemed obviously disturbed. Her phone charger still plugged in, school books neatly arranged on her desk. But detectives noticed something odd. One of the windows was slightly open, and faint smudges ran along the outer frame, as if someone had touched it recently. That night, Chantel couldn't sleep. She stayed in the living room, phone in hand, repeatedly calling Riley's number, praying she would pick up. Each time, she heard the same cold, automated voice. "The number you have dialed is unavailable." The following morning, May 9th, the investigation intensified. Police expanded their search area, bringing in K9 units to track Riley's scent. The dogs picked up a faint trail near the back of the house, but it abruptly stopped a few hundred feet away, close to the woods behind the neighborhood. Detectives also confirmed that the blue Dodge Ram Denise had seen parked near the back door the previous morning was registered to a friend of Andy's, a man named Jared, who sometimes lent Andy his truck for work. When questioned, Jared told police that Andy had borrowed the truck early on the morning of May 8th, claiming he needed it for a quick job. He returned it later that evening, acting nervous and tired, and asked Jared not to tell anyone he'd borrowed it. That statement changed everything. Investigators obtained a warrant to seize the Dodge Ram for forensic testing. Inside the truck, they found traces of dirt, small fibers, and faint blood stains on the back seat and floor mat too. Small to see at first glance, but unmistakable under luminol. At that moment, what had started as a missing person search began shifting into something far darker. The next step would uncover the horrifying truth of what had happened to Riley Crossman. The following day, May 10th, forensic teams began analyzing the evidence collected from the blue Dodge Ram. The results were grim. The blood found in the truck matched Riley's DNA. Detectives, now convinced that foul play was involved, immediately named Andy McCauley as a person of interest in Riley's disappearance. At the same time, investigators began retracing Andy's movements on the morning of May 8th. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses and traffic cameras showed the blue Dodge Ram traveling along Route 9, heading east out of Berkeley Springs around 6:30 a.m. The truck was next seen entering a rural area near the Hancock Bridge, a remote stretch surrounded by dense forest and steep hillsides. It wasn't seen again on camera until it returned to town later that afternoon. Detectives feared the worst. On May 16, 2019, 8 days after Riley vanished, police launched a large-scale search operation along Route 9, focusing on the wooded region beneath the Hancock Bridge, the same area where Andy's truck had been seen. Officers, volunteers, and K-9 units combed the thick brush and ravines, bracing themselves for the outcome no one wanted. At approximately 5:30 p.m., a search team made a grim discovery. Hidden down a steep embankment, partially covered by debris and wrapped in sheets, lay the body of a young girl. The scene was heartbreakingly silent as investigators confirmed what everyone had dreaded. It was Riley Crossman. Her remains were so badly decomposed from exposure that she was identified through dental records. The medical examiner later concluded that Riley had been smothered to death, likely by someone she knew and trusted. When news reached Chantel, she collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Her daughter, the bright, kind, artistic teenager she had raised and protected, was gone. That same evening, police arrested Andy McCauley at a friend's house. He offered no resistance, but denied everything, claiming he had nothing to do with Riley's death. Detectives, however, had already gathered a damning chain of evidence: blood in the truck, cell tower data placing his phone along Route 9 at the exact time of Riley's disappearance, and inconsistencies in his timeline. During interrogation, Andy appeared cold and emotionless. When asked about Riley, he simply said, "I don't know what happened to her." The community of Berkeley Springs was shaken to its core. Candlelight vigils were held outside Riley's high school, where hundreds gathered holding signs that read, "Justice for Riley." Her classmates, teachers, and friends described her as funny, caring, and full of life, a girl who loved art, dancing, and making everyone around her laugh. In May 2021, after nearly 2 years of delays and hearings, Andy McCauley finally went to trial for first-degree murder. The prosecution argued that he had killed Riley in the early morning hours of May 8th while Chantel was asleep, and then transported her body in his friend's truck to dispose of it under the bridge. The defense tried to claim there was no direct evidence placing Andy at the scene, but the jury wasn't convinced. On April 29, 2021, after just 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: guilty on all counts. When the sentence was read, life in prison without the possibility of parole, Chantel wept quietly in the courtroom. She later said through tears, "No sentence will ever bring my daughter back, but at least now she can finally rest in peace." Riley Crossman's story remains one of the most heartbreaking cases in West Virginia's history, a reminder of how violence can destroy a family in an instant, and how a mother's love can fuel a relentless fight for justice. Riley's disappearance was officially entered into the FBI's National Crime Information Center, and a large-scale search operation began. Law enforcement, volunteers, and the community rallied together, combing through the area in hopes of finding any trace of the missing 15-year-old. During this tense period, however, one detail deeply unsettled Chantel: Andy's strange reaction to the situation. When officers first arrived at the house to gather information, Andy returned home from work. The police informed him that Riley was missing. His face showed mild surprise, but not much else. He didn't ask questions. Not where she was last seen, not what the police were doing, not even if she had left a note. Instead, he quietly set down his work bag and personal belongings, leaving his phone behind, and said only that he was going out to search for her on his bicycle. At the time, Chantel took this as a sign of concern. She was too distraught to think critically and assumed Andy genuinely wanted to help. But by dawn, when the long night of searching ended and everyone returned home, exhausted, Chantel walked into the bedroom and froze. Andy was fast asleep, tucked in bed as though nothing had happened. The sight filled her with disbelief and anger. Riley wasn't his biological daughter, true, but after 2 years of living together, they were family. How could he sleep so peacefully when a child from their household was missing? The next morning, at exactly 9 a.m., a convoy of police cars pulled up outside the Crossman residence once more. Detectives stepped out to find Chantel standing outside, cigarette trembling between her fingers as she talked nervously on the phone. Seeing she was preoccupied, they went inside to begin a detailed inspection of Riley's bedroom. Her room was on the second floor, the second door on the right, and the moment they opened it, officers were taken aback. The place looked like it had been hit by a storm. Clothes, books, and makeup were strewn across the floor. The space that should have reflected a teenage girl's energy now resembled the aftermath of a break, dash and dot. In the middle of the floor lay Riley's school backpack. Beside it, the pair of glasses she wore every day, 2 items she never went anywhere without. On the floor near her mattress, officers also spotted her wallet, containing some cash and her student ID card. Moments later, Chantel hurried into the room, having finished her call. "Something's not right here," she said, her voice trembling. She began recounting what her son, Reed, had told her. The morning before, while getting ready for school, Reed had gone into Riley's room to borrow a pair of socks. He said the room was messy, Chantal explained, but not this messy. He swears there wasn't a backpack or glasses on the floor then. She pointed toward the head of the bed. And that TV, when Reed was here yesterday, it was still on the shelf. But this morning, it was lying flat on the floor. She added that Reed had already propped it back up before police arrived. Then she gestured toward the corner, where a bouquet of flowers lay crumpled on the floor. "Those were from her dance performance," she said softly. "Riley loved them. She'd never throw them like that." Her voice grew faint. "Yesterday, before work, I came up here to use the mirror. If her glasses had been on the floor right in front of it, I would have noticed, I'm sure of it." That raised an alarming question. Who had entered the room after Chantel and Red last saw it, and why had they moved these items? The theory of an intruder was quickly dismissed. The family owned a German Shepherd, a large and protective dog that barked at any unfamiliar sound, yet through the entire night, it had remained calm, not a single bark or growl. Officers continued their search, examining every inch of the room. Then one of them noticed faint brownish-red stains on Riley's bedsheet and pillow. The stains were immediately swabbed and sent for urgent forensic testing. When the results came back, they confirmed the family's worst fear. The samples contained both blood and saliva, and both matched Riley's DNA. That discovery marked a turning point. What had started as a missing person case was now officially being treated as a homicide. Investigation made a crucial discovery inside Riley's bedroom. Near the window, hidden behind the curtain, investigators had found faint traces of blood, though initially invisible to the naked eye. Luminol testing confirmed the presence of human blood droplets, but enough to raise major suspicion now. Seeing the fresh scratches on Andy's arms and torso, detectives began to connect the dots. The marks looked consistent with defensive wounds, the kind someone might receive if a victim had fought back. When questioned about them, Andy grew defensive. He claimed he'd gotten the scratches while working in the yard or fixing a fence. But his explanations didn't align with the weather or the condition of his hands. No dirt under the nails, no other signs of outdoor work. The interview room grew tense. Detectives pressed him harder, asking about his movements on the morning of May 8th. Andy repeated that he had left for work around 5 a.m., but inconsistencies started to surface. His phone records showed a gap between 11:15 p.m. on May 7th and 6:40 a.m. on May 8th. There were no calls, texts, or activity. Even more suspiciously, GPS data from Jared's blue Dodge Ram placed the truck near Back Creek Valley Road, a remote, wooded area at 5:30 a.m. that morning. When confronted with this, Andy froze. He looked down at the table, his breathing heavy, his answers clipped and evasive. Detectives noted that he avoided eye contact every time Riley's name was mentioned. By now, the case had shifted completely. What began as a desperate search for a missing teenager was rapidly transforming into a homicide investigation. And Andy McCauley, the man who had lived under the same roof as Riley, who was supposed to protect Herb, was now the prime suspect. Still, one question haunted the investigators. Where was Riley Crossman? To answer that, they would have to follow the evidence. Starting with the GPS trail that led deep into the hills outside Berkeley Springs. Cases. Andy's phone was active throughout the morning of May 8th, and not at his home, as he claimed, between 4:30 a.m. and 6 a.m. The phone pinged repeatedly along a route stretching from Berkeley Springs to the Back Creek Valley area, the same rural zone where the Dodge Ram's GPS had earlier been detected. This discovery completely dismantled Andy's alibi. The forgotten phone story was a lie. Investigators now had both physical evidence, the scratches, the blood, the GPS data, and digital proof contradicting his every word. Detectives decided to confront Andy with this information in the next interrogation session. As they laid out the phone records, GPS coordinates, and photos of the Dodge Ram's interior stains, Andy's demeanor shifted. He stopped making eye contact, his hands trembling as he fiddled with the cuffs of his orange jumpsuit. When pressed, he muttered, "I don't remember. I was high. Maybe I drove somewhere, but I don't know where." It was the first indirect admission that he'd left home that night, but investigators weren't interested in half-truths. They needed to find Riley, so they focused on the path that his phone and the truck had both taken that morning. GPS records showed the vehicle traveling west, leaving the main road around 5:25 a.m., and stopping for nearly 30 minutes in an isolated, forested stretch near Grapevine Road. The truck then turned around and drove straight to Andy's workplace. Where it arrived shortly after 7 a.m., a search team was immediately dispatched to the area. Officers combed through steep, wooded hills, creek beds, and abandoned logging trails. For 2 days, there was nothing. Then, on May 16, 2019, exactly 8 days after Riley vanished, a worker reported a foul odor coming from a remote embankment near Tuscarora Pike, just a few miles from where the truck had stopped according to GPS data. When police arrived, they discovered what they had feared all along. Hidden beneath branches and debris, wrapped in a bedsheet, were the remains of 15-year-old Riley Crossman. The scene was devastating. Detectives noted that the sheet matched the fabric pattern from Riley's bed at home. The body had been carefully concealed, suggesting the killer had known the area well and wanted to delay discovery. Forensic results later confirmed the worst. Traces of Andy's DNA were present on the sheet, on the tape used to wrap it, and under Riley's fingernails. The case that began as a missing person report had now become a murder investigation, and there was no longer any doubt who was responsible. Next, detectives would focus on proving how Andy killed Riley and uncovering the chilling motive behind his actions. When investigators officially reclassified the case as homicide, the focus turned to reconstructing the final hours of Riley's life. Every piece of evidence collected from the house, Andy's truck, and his work site was re-examined with a new perspective. The forensic lab provided crucial updates. In the Dodge Ram that Andy had been driving, Technicians found blood traces under the rear seat carpet, faint but undeniable. The DNA matched Riley. It was the final link connecting the crime scene to Andy's vehicle. In addition, cadaver dogs brought to the scene of the discovery reacted strongly inside the truck bed, signaling that a human body had been there recently. Detectives now had to determine the sequence of events. On the night of May 7th, from what they pieced together, around 10:30 p.m., Riley ended her video call with her boyfriend Hayden and likely went to bed. Not long after, she texted him again at 11:01 p.m., saying Andy was in her room and she was scared. Those were the last known words she ever sent. Based on forensic analysis, police believed that Riley was attacked sometime between 11:10 and 11:30 p.m. inside her bedroom. The small bloodstains on her pillow and bedsheets suggested that she had been smothered or restrained, and possibly struck in the struggle. Afterward, investigators believed Andy carried her body downstairs. A faint drag mark found on the hallway carpet, along with 2 broken floorboards, supported this theory. At the bottom of the stairs, near the bathroom door, was where Andy's blood had been found, likely from a scratch inflicted by Riley as she fought back. From there, Andy may have placed her body in a bedsheet taken directly from her bed, the same sheet later found wrapped around her remains. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's security camera further strengthened the timeline, though it was dark and grainy around 2 a.m. A faint silhouette of a man could be seen walking toward the driveway, followed by the unmistakable sound of a vehicle door slamming. Moments later, headlights flickered on, and a truck matching the Dodge Ram drove away slowly into the night. What followed, according to GPS data, was Andy's drive through back roads into the remote hills of Berkeley County, where he dumped Riley's body. The stop lasted roughly 30 minutes before he returned home, cleaned himself up, and pretended to sleep, while the entire family searched desperately for Riley's whereabouts. When detectives laid out this sequence in the interrogation room, Andy refused to say a word. For the first time, he didn't argue or invent a story. He simply sat still, eyes down, breathing heavy. By May 16th, police had enough evidence to formally charge Andy McCauley with first-degree murder, concealment of a body, and tampering with evidence. When news of the arrest reached the community, it sent shockwaves through Berkeley Springs. Friends and neighbors who had joined the initial search were heartbroken and furious. Many couldn't comprehend how someone who had lived with the family, who had eaten dinner with them, who had smiled in photos beside Riley, could commit such a monstrous act. In the following weeks, as the case moved toward trial, more disturbing details about Andy's past began to surface. He had once been accused of inappropriate behavior toward a teenage girl in 2014, but had never been formally charged. In addition, coworkers described Andy as a man with violent mood swings, worsened by drugs and paranoia. The prosecution now had a clear goal: prove not just that Andy killed Riley, but that he did it with intent to silence her after she rejected his disturbing advances. And when the court proceedings began, the full, harrowing truth of what happened inside that quiet house on May 7th would finally come to light. Obstacle Chantal, Riley's mother, was still asleep in the house. Any noise or sudden movement risked waking her, exposing what he had just done. Panicked and trembling, Andy tried to think fast. He used a bedsheet from Riley's bed to wrap her body, then waited in the dark, listening for sounds from downstairs. Around 2 a.m., when the house was completely silent, he carried Riley's body out of the bedroom. Investigators later confirmed faint drag marks on the carpet and traces of blood near the staircase railing. Silent witnesses to that terrible night. Once he reached the ground floor, Andy placed Riley's body near the bathroom door for a short while, where his blood was also later found. That was likely when he got the deep scratches and cuts on his arms and torso, the result of Riley's desperate struggle. After a few minutes, He gathered the industrial garbage bags he kept for construction work, placed the wrapped body inside, and quietly carried it out to his pickup truck at around 2:30 a.m. Surveillance footage from a neighboring home captured a shadowy figure moving toward a parked vehicle. Moments later, the Dodge Ram's headlights flickered on, and the truck rolled away into the night. Andy then drove nearly 40 minutes through winding back roads toward the remote Muttenberg Mountain area, a region he knew well from his construction jobs. There, in a patch of dense grass off a dirt trail, he dumped Riley's body. To delay decomposition and reduce odor, Andy scattered white lime, the same material found in his truck bed, over the body. He then covered everything with branches and debris before leaving. By 4 a.m., he was on his way back home. The next morning, as though nothing had happened, Andy woke up early, called his coworker at 4:26 a.m. and again at 5:04 a.m., urging him to pick him up for work. Behavior that was completely out of character for him. When investigators later reconstructed the timeline, it all fit perfectly. Riley's final message, the suspicious window of time, the car's GPS route, and Andy's sudden urgency to leave home before sunrise. At the September 2021 trial, prosecutors laid out every piece of evidence, from phone tower data to the matching lime samples and unique construction screws found at the dump site. They emphasized how every small detail pointed back to Andy, and how the alleged accidental death theory he floated early on was a lie meant to disguise a violent, intentional act. Witnesses testified about Andy's strange behavior in the days after Riley's disappearance, sleeping soundly during search efforts, avoiding questions, and inventing inconsistent stories about his movements. The jury listened in stunned silence as prosecutors described the moment Riley sent her final message. "I'm scared. Andy's in my room." After 2 weeks of testimony and evidence review, the verdict was clear. Andy McCauley was found guilty of first-degree murder, concealment of a body, and tampering with evidence. When the sentence was read, the courtroom filled with tears. Riley's mother, Chantel, sobbed quietly, clutching a photo of her daughter. Andy showed no emotion, only a blank stare, as he was led away in handcuffs. The judge, in his closing statement, said coldly, "This was not an act of impulse. It was a conscious, calculated decision to harm, conceal, and deceive. The court sees no remorse, only cowardice." Andy McCauley was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the town of Berkeley Springs. The case left scars that may never fully heal. Riley's friends still visit her memorial near the school, where her favorite quote is engraved on a small stone plaque: "You can't see the stars without the darkness." On the afternoon of December 11, 2021, at exactly 3 p.m., Muhammad Amber Yunus, a 44-year-old engineer from Sabah, Malaysia, rushed into the local police station in visible distress. Breathless and trembling, he reported that upon returning home from a short trip with his wife, they had discovered their domestic helper, Narefia, dead inside their apartment. His voice shook as he spoke, beads of sweat running down his forehead while his fingers tapped nervously against the desk, every movement betraying a deep state of panic and confusion. When officers arrived at the apartment, they were immediately struck by a strange, unsettling odor that lingered in the air, a mix of harsh cleaning chemicals and a faintly metallic, fishy smell. Though not overpowering, it carried the unmistakable sense that someone had tried to mask the scent of something far worse. Lying motionless on the living room floor, covered with a thin blanket, was the body of Nur. Dark patches of dried blood had soaked through the edges of the fabric, staining it a deep brown and forming chilling patterns across the tile floor. Even at a glance, investigators could tell the scene had been meticulously cleaned. The floors were spotless, the furniture arranged with uncanny precision, too orderly, too deliberate for the site of a violent death. But trained investigators knew that no crime scene is ever truly clean. In the narrow space beneath the sofa, they discovered traces of dried blackened blood, remnants that had seeped into the cracks between the wall and floor. Under ultraviolet light, they found small fragments of tissue clinging stubbornly to the surface traces. The killer had missed. Then came the discovery that sent chills through the room. On the coffee table, beside a half-filled glass of murky water, investigators found what appeared to be small white fragments. Upon closer inspection, they were horrified to realize they were human teeth. The autopsy results only deepened the horror. The medical examiner determined that 4 of the victim's teeth had been forcibly extracted while she was still alive. Her gums were torn and bruised, showing clear signs of violent struggle. The head bore multiple wounds from a blunt instrument, each injury at a different stage of healing, evidence that the abuse had been ongoing, not confined to a single attack. Even more disturbing were the injuries found on her limbs. Her bones were fractured in several places, with the left arm showing signs of a break that had begun to heal improperly, likely inflicted 3 days before her death and left untreated. The break had partially fused in the wrong position, suggesting that the victim had been forced to continue working or suffering in silence. Village in Sulawesi, Indonesia, where job opportunities were scarce and poverty widespread. Coming from a humble background, Nerefia dreamed of working abroad to support her family and fund her younger siblings' education. When she secured a position as a domestic helper in Malaysia through a licensed agency, it was seen as a blessing, a rare chance at a better life. However, what awaited her inside Amber and Attica's luxurious apartment was not comfort or opportunity, but a nightmare of abuse and control. According to immigration records, she arrived in July 2020, and her legal employment contract clearly stated her right to fair treatment, proper living conditions, and a monthly salary of 800 Malaysian ringgit, roughly 190 United States dollars. Yet, as investigators soon discovered, Nerefia had never received a single payment during her entire employment. Her bank account had been inactive for over 6 months. Police concluded that her wages had been systematically withheld and most likely embezzled by her employers. The clues didn't end there. While searching the couple's master bedroom, police made another chilling discovery. Nerefia's passport and employment documents were locked inside the homeowner's personal safe, a clear violation of labor laws. Domestic workers are supposed to keep their personal identification with them, not in the control of their employers. This finding painted a grim picture of how the couple exercised complete dominance and confinement over the young woman's life. Neighbors' testimonies only confirmed this dark reality. Residents reported that for the past 3 months, they had frequently been jolted awake at night by terrifying screams, cries of a woman pleading for mercy, and the sound of violent banging echoing through the walls. Each time they tried to check, Adika would appear irritated, brushing off their concerns with excuses like, "She broke something again. I'm just teaching her a lesson." Her cold, dismissive tone discouraged further questions. One neighbor living directly below the couple's apartment also recounted hearing heavy dragging noises in the early hours of the morning, objects being moved or pulled across the floor, followed by sudden silence. At the time, they assumed it was late-night cleaning, but after the murder came to light, those same sounds became haunting evidence of what had truly been happening upstairs. What shocked the public most was the identity of the perpetrator. Adika Siti Norashikin Masulong was not some anonymous figure. She was a former MasterChef Malaysia finalist, once beloved nationwide for her talent and charm. A graduate of the University of Sabah with a master's degree in geology, Adika had built a respectable career as an engineer in the oil and gas industry. Her 2012 MasterChef appearance had made her a household name. On television, she had appeared graceful and intelligent, dressed neatly in her white apron, a soft smile on her lips as she passionately explained her dishes and cultural recipes. She had impressed judges and audiences alike, earning a spot among the top 3 finalists of the season. Her husband, Muhammad Amber Yunus, was equally admired, a well-known construction contractor whose company handled major regional projects. Together, they embodied the image of success: a high-rise apartment, imported cars, and a picture-perfect family frequently seen at community gatherings with their 2 children. But beneath that polished exterior hid a brutal truth, one of cruelty, control, and violence. The public's disbelief only deepened as investigators began to piece together what really happened behind the walls of that immaculate apartment. Investigators also delved into the couple's psychological profiles and behavioral patterns leading up to the murder. What emerged was a chilling portrait of systematic domination and cruelty that had turned the victim's final months into a waking nightmare. Through analysis of digital forensics, including deleted texts, call logs, and recovered videos, police reconstructed the final days of Nurafia's life. The evidence suggested that her employers, Adika and Amory, had long treated her as property rather than a person. The pattern of abuse escalated from verbal humiliation to physical violence, then to deliberate torture. Witness testimonies from nearby residents helped connect these findings. Several neighbors recalled seeing Adika shouting at Nur on the balcony, sometimes hurling objects at her. One neighbor stated that just a week before the discovery of the body, they heard a piercing scream, followed by thudding sounds, as if something heavy had been repeatedly struck against the floor. When the interrogations began on December 14th, Adika and Amory both maintained their fabricated alibi that they had been away traveling during the time of the murder. They presented travel tickets, receipts, and photos. But investigators were already aware these were premeditated attempts to build a false timeline. When confronted with the CCTV footage showing their return to the apartment on December 10th, both fell silent. Under mounting pressure, Amory began to show signs of nervousness, his hands trembling, his breathing uneven. Finally, after hours of questioning, he confessed that they had returned early to deal with a problem with the maid. That problem, as investigators soon realized, referred to Nur's deteriorating physical state after months of abuse. Forensic reports concluded that, in the 48 hours before her death, Nur had suffered the most intense and continuous violence of her life. Bruises and open wounds covered nearly 80% of her body. The autopsy determined that her cause of death was severe cranial trauma caused by multiple blunt force blows to the head, compounded by internal bleeding and shock from prolonged torture. The sheer brutality of her injuries, the tooth extractions, burns, ligature marks, and hair removal, revealed a methodical and sadistic pattern. Experts stated that such acts weren't spontaneous rage, but deliberate, controlled inflictions, designed to humiliate and dehumanize. When confronted with the medical evidence, Attica's demeanor changed drastically. Gone was the confident, composed woman once adored on television. She broke down, crying uncontrollably, claiming she had just wanted to discipline the maid and didn't mean to kill her. Yet, her statements were inconsistent and self-serving in one shocking detail. Amari admitted that he had recorded several videos of the abuse at Attica's instruction. When investigators asked why, he coldly replied that his wife wanted proof of how useless the maid was. Those recordings became crucial evidence, each frame exposing the unimaginable cruelty hidden behind the couple's polished image. Public outrage erupted across Malaysia as the case details surfaced. Many struggled to reconcile the woman who once smiled on MasterChef Malaysia with the monster who had tortured another human being to death. The case sparked nationwide debate about domestic worker abuse, power imbalance, and the exploitation of migrant labor. By March 2022, prosecutors had compiled overwhelming evidence, digital, forensic, and testimonial. Adika City, Nora Shikin, Ma Sulong, and Mohammed Amri Yunus were officially charged with first-degree murder, facing the possibility of death by hanging under Malaysian law. Court of Appeal insisting that the High Court's refusal to grant her bail was unfair and violated her human rights. Her legal team argued that the prosecution's claims about potential witness interference were speculative and unsupported by solid evidence. They further claimed that her deteriorating mental health required urgent treatment that could not be adequately provided in custody. However, during the hearing, the prosecution once again presented strong counterarguments. They reminded the court that this was not a standard criminal case, but one involving extreme cruelty and deliberate torture leading to death. The prosecutors emphasized that the defendants not only caused Noor's death, but also documented their actions with perverse pride. Such behavior, they argued, reflected a high likelihood of continued danger to society if released, adding weight to the prosecution's argument was new testimony from a former domestic worker who had briefly worked for the couple in 2019. She described how Adek had displayed similar violent tendencies toward other employees, including verbal abuse and physical intimidation, although no deaths had occurred during that period. Her testimony painted a consistent pattern of aggression, control, and psychological manipulation. By July 2022, after months of deliberation, the Court of Appeal upheld the High Court's decision. The panel of judges unanimously ruled that the defendants' crimes were too grave to warrant bail under any humanitarian grounds. In their written judgment, they described the acts committed by Adekaka and Ambry as unfathomable cruelty and a chilling display of human depravity. With the bail appeal dismissed, the trial proceeded in full. Witnesses, including forensic experts, neighbors, and digital investigators, were called to testify. The court heard in disturbing detail how Noor's final days were marked by constant torment, how her injuries were inflicted methodically, and how her final recorded moments revealed a desperate plea for help that never came. As the trial entered its final stage, public outrage continued to swell. Outside the courthouse, dozens of people gathered holding placards demanding justice for Noor. On social media, the hashtag #JusticeForNoor began trending, uniting thousands of users who demanded the harshest possible punishment for the couple. In October 2022, after nearly a year of proceedings, the High Court delivered its verdict. The judge found both Adekaka and Ambry guilty of murder under Section 302 of the Malaysian Penal Code, which carries a mandatory death penalty. The courtroom was silent as the judgment was read aloud. The judge condemned their actions as a deliberate campaign of sadistic torture inflicted on a defenseless individual, and said that no amount of remorse can erase the horror of what was done. When asked if they had any final words before sentencing, Ambry remained silent, eyes fixed on the floor. Adekaka, on the other hand, broke down in tears, crying that she never meant for Noor to die, that it was just punishment gone too far. The judge responded coldly that her words meant little compared to the suffering she had inflicted. The following month, both were formally sentenced to death by hanging. Although Malaysia had begun reforming its capital punishment laws, their crime was considered so egregious that no leniency was applied. The couple was immediately transferred to Kayang prison, where they would await the outcome of any future appeals. But the story didn't end there. In early 2023, a new twist emerged, one that reignited public discussion about the case. Supreme Court in Phuket, the highest judicial authority in Malaysia. The final verdict was delivered after nearly 4 years of relentless legal battles, emotional testimonies, and public outrage that never truly faded. The courtroom was packed that morning. Journalists, activists, representatives from Indonesian labor rights groups, and even members of the diplomatic community filled every available seat. Outside, a crowd had gathered, holding banners demanding justice for Noor and stop the abuse of migrant workers. The air was tense, as everyone waited for what would become one of the most closely followed rulings in Malaysia's modern legal history. The lead judge, Chief Justice Datuk Seri Rahman Idris began by meticulously summarizing the evidence, the digital files, forensic reports, eyewitness accounts, and the damning 27 unedited torture videos that had been presented during trial. His voice remained calm and measured, but the silence in the courtroom deepened with every word. The acts recorded, he stated, reflect not moments of anger, nor temporary loss of control, but deliberate, prolonged cruelty driven by sadistic intent. The victim's suffering was not incidental. It was the purpose of the defendant's actions. He went on to reject the defense's claims of mental instability, maternal responsibility, or coerced participation. The Supreme Court concluded that both defendants had acted voluntarily and in coordination, each amplifying the other's brutality. The judges unanimously agreed with the lower courts. This was a case of joint culpability in a murder that shocked the conscience of the nation. Then came the moment of final judgment. The Chief Justice announced, "In light of the overwhelming evidence, and in the interest of justice, this court hereby upholds the conviction of both defendants, Adekaka and Embry, on the charge of murder under Section 302 of the Penal Code." The court further rules that, despite the recent abolition of mandatory capital punishment, the gravity and inhumanity of this case warrant the imposition of the death penalty. Both defendants shall be sentenced to death. Gasps filled the courtroom. Adekaka collapsed into tears, clutching her lawyer's arm, while Ambry remained motionless, staring straight ahead. Members of Nur's family wept openly, some praying quietly. Outside the courthouse, the announcement was met with a mixture of cheers and tears for many. It was not celebration, but a sense of long-awaited closure. In his closing remarks, the Chief Justice made a statement that resonated across Malaysia and Indonesia alike. This judgment stands not only for Nur, but for every silent victim of domestic labor abuse whose suffering has been ignored. The law must remain a shield for the powerless and a sword against cruelty. Following the verdict, both Adekaka and Ambry were transferred back to Kayang prison to await the implementation of their sentences. According to Malaysian legal procedure, they still retained the right to submit a clemency petition to the Yang di-Pertuan Agong, the king, within 14 days. However, given the unprecedented public attention and the moral clarity of the ruling, legal experts widely considered their chances of mercy to be nearly zero. As the case officially concluded, the Indonesian embassy in Kuala Lumpur released a statement praising Malaysia's judicial system for its firm and transparent handling of an exceptionally brutal crime. Nur's remains, long since returned to her hometown in Lombok, became a symbol of reform for migrant worker rights. Her name was later memorialized in a new bilateral initiative between Indonesia and Malaysia called the Nur Protection Accord, aimed at improving safety standards for foreign domestic workers. And so, 4 years after a young woman's life was extinguished behind closed doors, justice, though delayed, was finally served. In the months that followed the final verdict, the story of Nur's case continued to ripple across Malaysia, Indonesia, and beyond. It was no longer just a criminal case. It had become a symbol, a mirror reflecting both the darkest depths of human cruelty and the fragile hope for justice in a system often accused of neglecting the powerless. Inside Kayang prison, life for Adekaka and Ambry changed drastically. Their notoriety made them pariahs, even among other inmates. Prison guards monitored them closely, fearing retaliation from other prisoners, many of whom had been deeply angered by the nature of their crimes. According to later prison reports leaked to local media, Adekaka spent most of her time isolated, reading religious books and writing letters to her children, though none were ever made public. She reportedly showed signs of deteriorating mental health, alternating between long periods of silence and sudden emotional breakdowns. Ambry, on the other hand, adapted in a colder, more mechanical way. He rarely spoke, spent most of his hours in prayer or solitude, and refused to interact with journalists who attempted to contact him. Prison chaplains described him as a man who prays for forgiveness, but never truly repents. Meanwhile, outside prison walls, Nur's legacy grew. In Indonesia, her family, once poor villagers from Lombok, became reluctant public figures. Nur's mother, in interviews, often said through tears, "We sent her to Malaysia to find a better life. We never knew we were sending her to her death." The Indonesian government, under mounting public pressure, began enforcing stricter monitoring systems for citizens working abroad. New clauses were added to bilateral labor agreements, requiring that all domestic workers have access to verified hotlines and weekly welfare check-ins from embassy representatives. Malaysia, too, passed new regulations tightening oversight of domestic employment contracts, including the introduction of a worker safety digital tracking system inspired directly by Nur's tragedy. By mid-2026, documentaries and news specials began airing across Southeast Asia. One titled "The House That Became a Prison" drew millions of viewers, chronicling Nur's story through testimony, police evidence, and emotional interviews with migrant activists. The documentary's release sparked renewed calls for harsher penalties against employers who exploit or abuse foreign workers. On social media, the hashtag #JusticeForNur transformed into #RememberNur, marking the anniversary of her death each December with online vigils and digital candles. NGOs began using her story in awareness campaigns to highlight domestic worker abuse worldwide. Then, in early 2027, an official statement from the Prime Minister's office confirmed that both clemency petitions filed by Adekaka and Ambry had been rejected. The rejection was brief, almost procedural, but symbolically, it was the state's final word. A month later, on February 17, 2027, both were executed at dawn in Kayong prison. No family members attended. Their bodies were quietly buried in unmarked graves within the prison cemetery. Per standard procedure, the announcement of their execution made global headlines, but the public reaction was subdued. There were no celebrations, only silence, reflection, and an undercurrent of somber justice. For Nur's family, it was not closure, but a moment of peace. Her mother said in an interview later that year, "Justice is not happiness. It only means the world finally saw what they did to her. My daughter can't come back, but maybe others will be safe now." In the years that followed, the Nur Protection Accord continued to expand, adopted by other ASEAN nations as a regional framework. Her story began appearing in university ethics courses, human rights conferences, and even literature, as a reminder of how empathy must never be lost behind domestic walls. And in her hometown in Lombok, a small statue now stands in front of the community center, carved from white marble. It depicts a woman looking toward the horizon, holding a small flower. Beneath it, engraved in both Bahasa, Indonesia, and Malay, are the words, "Nur, she came seeking light, but gave light to others instead." At the Supreme Court, the final verdict was delivered. Both Adekaka and Ambry were convicted of murder, with aggravating circumstances, and sentenced to 34 years imprisonment. Ambry also received 12 strokes of the cane, while Adekaka, protected by regulations that prohibit corporal punishment for women, was exempted from caning. Deputy Public Prosecutor Deja expressed dissatisfaction with the outcome. He emphasized that the victim, who had traveled far from her homeland during a pandemic in search of decent work, was not only denied her wages, but also subjected to prolonged torture before her life was cruelly taken. Despite the conclusion of the trial, many struggle to understand how a young, socially prominent couple with considerable wealth could abandon all humanity to commit such unthinkable acts. Criminal psychology experts analyzing the case identified several key factors. For Adekaka, a distorted desire for control played a central role. Her early fame on the national cooking competition MasterChef Malaysia had given her intense attention and admiration. However, after the show ended, her popularity sharply declined. The experience instilled in her a craving for domination, admiration, and control over others. Within the isolated confines of her home, Noor, a vulnerable and entirely dependent domestic helper, became the perfect target. Adeka imposed harsh and inhumane rules, demanding absolute obedience, and any perceived disobedience or failure to meet her expectations was met with escalating brutality. Her psychological profile was shaped by her upbringing in a family with extreme expectations. No matter her efforts, her parents' constant criticism and subtle, emotional punishments, including prolonged silence and withdrawn affection, instilled in her a callousness and inability to empathize with others' suffering. Her focus became entirely on satisfying her own desires and emotions. For Ambry, his upbringing in a traditional patriarchal family emphasized extreme male superiority. From childhood, he was indoctrinated with the belief that men must dominate, and that women and lower social classes must submit completely. This toxic ideology left him indifferent to the suffering of anyone he deemed inferior. As the rain gently falls and the night grows deeper, thank you for joining me here at Crime Whisper. True crime reminds us of life's hidden mysteries and the importance of staying vigilant, even in moments of comfort and quiet. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep, and until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you.